My name is David Kaczynski. Was born in Chicago, but now live in upstate New York. I'm currently the executive director of Karma Triyana Dharma Chakra Monastery in Woodstock, New York, which is a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. Prior to that, I was executive director of New Yorkers for Alternatives to the Death Penalty. Prior to that, I was a social worker working with kids, teenagers in a runaway homeless youth shelter. I'll probably be forever remembered, unfortunately, as the brother of Theodore Kaczynski, also known as the Unabomber. Unlike the other panelists here, I'm not an expert in mental health. I'm not an expert in Buddhism. What I have to tell you are my personal story, snippets of my personal story. About the time I was first getting interested in Buddhism and beginning to take teachings in Buddhism, I was serving as a assistant director of a runaway homeless youth shelter in Albany, New York. And I actually got a great deal of satisfaction out of trying to help troubled kids and their families, but also some sense of, helplessness. I can't always help them in the way they won't listen to my good advice and so forth. Sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. But I was really struck by the commonality between a kind of Buddhist approach to people and best practices in social work. It seemed like there was a real clear sense that you treat people with compassion, with respect. And I think part of what I really understood and picked up is the idea of journey. In Buddhism, we often call it a path, but a sense that everyone is on a path. They're not necessarily going to be where you want them to be or where you think they should be, and that everybody's path is unique and individual. And certainly that sense of journey was to become more important for me as I went through my own life trauma. In 1990, I had the good fortune to marry a woman I'd adored for years, had met in the 7th grade, and she ultimately said, "Yeah, Dave, I kind of like you too." And her name is Linda, a huge important part of this story. I think the important thing maybe is to maybe look at this from a family member's perspective. Linda was actually the first person to help me understand after we were married that my brother Ted wasn't just a little different, just wasn't eccentric, but that there was actual mental illness there. We consulted with a psychiatrist. We asked for, help and how we could help Ted, but Ted had by this time isolated himself out in the woods in Montana. He basically had cut off from us about the time I was married. He'd cut off from our parents some years before. So again, there was this sense of helplessness. I'd like to help my brother, but I don't know how. But in some ways, the family is the last to know. It was about 5 years later that Linda came to me and said, "David, do you think any possibility, don't get angry at me, but do you think any possibility that your brother could be this Unabomber that everybody is talking about?" And my first reaction was absolutely no way. I mean, Ted had never been violent. I never remembered him being violent. Sure, he's mentally ill, but you got to understand, most people with mental illness are not at all violent, no more violent than the rest of us. And I was actually a little offended, but as time went on and Linda was persistent, and ultimately the Unabomber's Manifesto was published in the Washington Post, and I read it, and all of a sudden I got this horrible chill and began to feel, my gosh, this sounds like my brother's voice. And in those early days, I still thought it was only a slim possibility, but I'd sort of opened the door a crack and was beginning to understand that it might be real. As we studied, as we investigated, the time went on, and at one point I remember lying in bed with my wife and saying, "Hon, I think it might be a 50-50 chance." And this was really the first time I'd acknowledged to Linda. Linda, ironically, had never met Ted, so it was kind of like I was the sort of reality check for her suspicions, and ultimately we got to the point where we felt we were facing a choice. And if you think about it, it was an extraordinarily dramatic choice. It seemed like a no-win situation. Whatever choice we made could lead to somebody dying. If we did nothing and my brother was indeed the Unabomber, some other person, innocent person, might die. On the other hand, if we went to the authorities, turned Ted in, if we stopped the Unabomber, he could well be subject to the death penalty or killed when he was being arrested. At this point, I actually agonized and decided not to tell our mother. At this point, she was 79 years old. She had worried about Ted for years because of his estrangement from the family. Believe me, Mom's worst nightmare didn't come close to this possibility that my brother might be the most wanted person in America, a serial killer. I think whether you're a family member of a victim of homicide or you're a family member of a murderer, boy, you're the last to think that this was going to happen in your family. You don't imagine that your family is going to be affected in this way. Ultimately, I think Linda and I felt we really had no choice. I mean, we could not live with ourselves. If we did nothing and another innocent person died, we'd have to go through the rest of our lives with blood on our hands. And in some ways, I really need to, my story has been told plenty. Linda's story has not been told, and yet it's an absolute essential key. It's that bystander who sees something and has the courage maybe to take a risk and to press a little farther and to say what needs to be said. Not to bury that uncomfortable thought, but to pursue it in the interests of protecting other people. Even when we went to the FBI, I thought it might be 50-50 at that point, and so we hoped and prayed that I'd never have to tell Mom, that they would investigate and find out that Ted was completely innocent. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and the day came when one of the FBI agents called me and said, "David, I'm sorry to have to tell you this, but your brother has actually moved to the top of our suspect list. We really need to speak with your mom. Now, do you think maybe you could go to your mom, tell her kind of what's going on, and try to persuade her to meet with us?" So this meant going to my mom, telling her something that was going to end her happiness, possibly make her very angry at me. When I told her what I'd done, I was afraid that I'd lose her love that day. I remember I went to my mom's apartment. She lived about 3 miles from us at that point. I knocked on her door. She opens her door. At first she's happy because her son is standing there, and then within a few seconds she gets this worried look on her face and she says, "David, you look terrible. What's the matter? Did something happen?" And I said, "Mom, I think you better sit down." And guess what Mom said? "Oh my God, did something happen to Ted?" She just worried for so many years, she somehow knew it was about Ted. But I persuaded her to go back into the apartment. She sat down. I was kind of pacing the floor thinking, how can I share this news with my mother in a way that doesn't absolutely crush her? And, I started talking about places the Unabomber had been and ideas, philosophies the Unabomber had written in his manifesto, and then pointed out the commonalities with her other son. And Mom, was a bright woman. She was connecting the dots very quickly, and she's sitting there just looking at me with this look of horror and disbelief on her face. And I knew my mother loved me with all her heart. I knew she loved Ted with all her heart. I had no idea how a mother would kind of put this together. One son suspected of horrible crimes, the other son perhaps having handed him over to the executioner. And I started crying a little bit, and at this point I just really had to lay all the cards out, and I said, Mom, I think there's a possibility Ted might be the Unabomber, and Mom, I've actually gone to the FBI. I've shared my suspicions. Let's hope I'm completely wrong, but Ted is currently under investigation. I lost Mom about 1.5 years ago, but this is the memory of my mother that I'll always carry with me till my dying day. At that point, she was quiet for a moment. There was kind of like a stunned silence. And then she got up out of her chair. She was a very short little woman, under 5 feet tall. I'm a little over 6 feet tall. And without saying a word, she just walked up to me. She reached her arms up around my neck. She pulled me down, and she put a kiss on my cheek. It's like a mother's blessing. And the first thing she said was, David, I can't imagine what you've been going through, what you've been struggling with. It had to have been the worst day of her life, and here she is, concerned about my feelings. And the next thing she said was the most comforting thing I could have heard. She said, David, I know that you love Ted. I know that you wouldn't have done this unless you truly felt that you had to. And in that moment, I realized I hadn't lost Mom's love, that Linda, Mom, and I would be in this, face this ordeal together. Ted was actually arrested about a week later, maybe 10 days later, and it was all over the national news. We'd actually received a promise of confidentiality. I was told by the government, nobody will ever know how we caught your brother. Well, you know how that turned out. Here I am watching the TV, and not only is my brother being arrested, and there's one of the evening anchors saying, well, you know, another interesting sidelight, apparently Kaczynski was turned in by his own brother, David, who lives in Schenectady, New York. And, you know, within minutes, like in Mom's parking lot, there were satellite trucks and cameras and satellite dishes, and, you know, all of a sudden this sort of very personal, private, ethical decision, family tragedy was all public, and people wondering, you know, what kind of a brother would turn in a brother? What kind of a family could possibly produce someone this deranged and this violent? I know at one point, I think that this was when the government did announce that they would seek the death penalty against my brother. I was feeling like a victim. Now, nobody had hurt me. Nobody had hurt any of my loved ones. But I felt, look, I did this difficult thing, and here's how I'm repaid. They break a promise to me. When government and I were working together, it was to save lives. But now that the government wants to kill someone, we're on different sides. I don't want my brother to die. And I think, you know, I would come home from work and I would rant and be angry, and I felt, you know, this sort of despair and anger and felt like a victim. And, you know, at one point, Linda just heard a little bit too much of it. And she said, David, you know, if you think this is about you, you got another thing coming. You know, this is, sure, you know, this is really awful stuff, but there are real victims out there. There are people who've been maimed, there are people who've been killed, there are families that will never, ever be the same. And I said, oh, but my pain is different. I have guilt on top of all of that. And, you know, maybe you can imagine the rest of the conversation, but it kind of ended like with me thinking, maybe I need to reframe this. And the next morning, Linda and I have been Buddhist. We do a morning meditation. When we went into our meditation room in the morning, I saw that she had put up 3 candles on the altar. And I didn't have to ask who those candles represented. They represented the 3 people that my brother had killed and their families. And so for the next 3 or 4 years, we meditated on compassion, trying to understand and grasp some element of the harm that my brother had done. My brother was lucky. Unlike a lot of people who commit serious crimes, my brother had great attorneys. Our family really went to bat for him, trying to explain to people that he was seriously mentally ill. This case was different. In any case, the case was resolved. The legal case was resolved with life. My brother was given life. My mother and I attended the trial in Sacramento, California, and on the day that the trial ended, Mom and I were in the apartment we had rented, obviously not celebrating, actually kind of wondering very quietly, how are we going to go on? What are we going to do with this for the rest of our lives? When the telephone rang and we were contacted by a chaplain who identified herself as working with law enforcement in Sacramento, and she was calling to let us know that there was a victim family that wanted to meet with us. I actually wanted to protect Mom. I thought, gee, these folks are probably going to be really angry, you know. Mom, why don't you stay here? I'll go and meet with the victims. And Mom wouldn't hear of it. She said, if they want to talk to me, how could I possibly say no? So The chaplain came and picked us up, drove us back to the federal building where the trial had been held, but this time she took us into an upper floor, let us out of an elevator, ushered us into a conference room, and as Mom and I walked into this room, we saw that there were 5 chairs arranged in a circle. 3 of the chairs held the wife of somebody my brother had killed, her sister, and her late husband's sister. The 2 vacant chairs were obviously waiting for me and Mom to sit down in. As we walked in, there was only one thing we could be saying, which is, we're sorry, we're so sorry. I saw a tear trickling down Mom's face, and as we sat down, I was kind of almost prepared, for a blast of anger, hostility. I really didn't know why they wanted to see us. And the widow spoke for the family. The first thing she said was that they had talked about this during the trial. They had decided that if there was ever an opportunity to do it in person, they wanted to thank us for turning in Ted. So they hadn't called us there to yell at us. They called us there to thank us. And that seemed to me, under the circumstances, extraordinarily moving and graceful. She said she couldn't imagine what it would be like to turn in a family member in a death penalty case. And I'm thinking, I can't imagine what it would be like to lose my spouse to some maniac's bomb. We actually ended up, hugging, crying all together. It's like, for all the therapy I'd received, and I've received plenty over these times, the counseling and the friendship and the hugging from friends and neighbors, nothing was more meaningful for me than this opportunity to meet with a family of victims. And I think for me, what was so meaningful about it is that it had a promise, if not a promise, like a suggestion that maybe healing could begin. If these 2 families could talk to each other, if they could be decent, if they could recognize each other's pain, maybe the world could be healed. The world, so many worlds blown apart by my brother, could begin to brought together. Mom was remember, she's Ted Kaczynski's mother, and she had something that she needed to say, and it probably wasn't the right time and place if you think about it. But what she said was, I want you to understand, my son isn't an evil person. He's very, very sick. He's not a monster. He's just really mentally ill. And she started talking about schizophrenia, and I happened to be looking into the faces of the 3 women, and I realized they didn't like what they were hearing. It was like Mom was trying to tell them something. What they heard was somebody making excuses. And I almost wished there was some way I could gesture to my mom to get her to change the subject, but she kept going on, and at one point she really did cross a line. She said, it really isn't my son that we should blame, it's his illness. And the widow at that point just blurted out, she said, he knew what he was doing. And all of a sudden, it was like the room was frozen in silence. Like, we'd felt so close to this family, and now put Ted in the mix, and it's like the Grand Canyon is between us. And I'm thinking maybe we tried too much. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe we just needed to leave and somehow do it gracefully. At that point, I saw Mom just sort of scrunch up almost into a ball, like almost trying to hide right in the middle of the room. And looking down at her shoes, she said, I really wish you had killed me instead of your husband. I think that was the truth. If Mom could have laid down her life to erase any of this pain, she would have done so. But when she said that, I happened to be looking at the widow's face, and I saw some of the hardness melt, and some tears begin to well up. She had children too. She could identify with Mom as a mother to a mother, and she said, oh, Mrs. Kaczynski. She got up out of her chair, she knelt right down in front of my mom, put her hand up on Mom's shoulder and said, oh, Mrs. Kaczynski, none of this is your fault. You're not to blame. Don't ever, ever think that we blame you for this. It was really, in some ways, it was the most memorable thing that happened for me, because I saw a human being in pain trying to comfort another human being in pain. It was like there was some possibility that this practice of compassion could actually transform everything, you know. None of our lives will be the same. You know, our journeys were changed. This community will never be the same. Clearly, people directly impacted and their families will never be the same. I think we can work with the emotions. I think we can take them toward a place of compassion and love. It's the only way forward.
When Adam Lanza did what he did, especially involving children, it just strikes me that there's a component of his, I guess I'd say his humanity that had been switched off. Almost like he became non-human or subhuman or inhuman at a minimum. And a parallel that the gentleman on the left had mentioned earlier, paralleled in very brief fashion his actions with those of Hitler. And perhaps there would be a similar parallel with Mr. Kaczynski's brother. My question is, why does that happen? What causes humans to switch it off? I don't know that you'll have an answer, but it's been on my mind.
You know, when something like what happened here happens, people all over the world question, how could any human being do this? And, you know, for the community, that is a more intense question. How could one of us do this? And, you know, when somebody like my brother does this from our family, the question becomes extraordinarily, like existentially intense. Like, how could my own brother do this? Someone I love, someone I felt close to, someone who I know is capable of compassion. I don't know the whole answer. Certainly, I don't begin. I have some thoughts about it, and one is it's connected to hatred. It's like hatred in self and hatred of other really do go together. And so my biggest fear for many years, actually, after a friend's brother committed suicide, was that Ted seemed so miserable. I was afraid someday I'd hear that he'd committed suicide. And I think that was likely. In his diaries, he actually had some sort of scenario that involved murder-suicide. I think some of his aggression toward our family, our parents, which I really couldn't understand, was emotionally violent. In some sense, metaphorically, it was killing Mom and Dad, but it had some of that flavor. I also think we're not being honest with ourselves if we don't look at human history and say there's something somewhat normal about violence in human beings. Like, how does this happen? I mean, we have murders, we have genocides, we have wars. I remember my father telling a story from his father, who had been born in Poland and pressed into the Polish army, and he said, well, we went to fight this battle, and I don't know what happened, but we started killing everybody in the town, and then men started raping women, and these were like normal family men. How did this happen? You know, we know that part of the training of soldiers is to desensitize to the humanity of the enemy. So it's true we can be trained for compassion. You know, we can be trained to shut down compassion. So I think the highest teachings of all religious traditions is to try to create an antidote to this nihilistic possibility that probably lives to some extent in all of us, to smaller or greater degrees. When I ultimately ended up reading my brother's diaries, it was like opening a window on hell. Like, I had no idea he was suffering to this extent. So part of his dynamic, and maybe with other mass murderers, there's this incredible, intense psychological isolation. So then I think, well, if only Ted had had a friend, a mentor, and then of course I realized many people could have been, but he pushed them away, you know. But how do you reach that person that's really, really hard to reach? Certainly we see some correlation, like with bullying in the schools. So the kid is isolated, the kid feels absolutely powerless. This is not to excuse violent acting out, but it strikes me we have to really, I actually agree with Dr. Knoll, but I also think it's creating a different kind of communal consciousness as well. It's not just our individual minds, it's the candle, lighting the candle 1,000 times, that somehow we have to make this idea of compassion, we have to find a way to spread it, and not give up, and not fail to spread it with people who seem resistant to it, you know, and you know, we can't blame them for their resistance. It's like, I don't know, but I do believe that communities can actually have a collective kind of consciousness, and I have to say I'm incredibly impressed by what I've seen and read about this community in terms of your commitment, your devotion to say the victims will be remembered and positive change is going to come out of this tragedy. I think it's possible. That's what keeps me going. It's also why I practice Buddhism. I want to say something, just one more thing really quickly, and then I'll be quiet. But I want to just talk a little bit about what would I say, the way, contagiousness of compassion. My wife and I have quite a connection with the state of Connecticut. We actually have an apartment that we keep in Bloomfield in case they fire us at the monastery. But it goes back before that. Shortly after my brother's trial, I received a phone call from a man in Connecticut who's actually sitting right here. His name is Dr. Sam Rieger. And Sam Rieger and his wife Wanda invited me to a conference called the Melanie Eileen Rieger Conference Against Violence. And I have gone, 14 or 15 years in a row now. I'll be going again this year. And these are folks, and all the folks that work with them are people who've lost loved ones to homicide, who have made a decision. Think of the title, A Conference Against Violence. And it was there I really began first to build a bridge, really, to the sense that, you know, victims' families and offenders' families have a lot in common in certain ways, and we have a common cause to prevent violence and to work on healing.
I have a question for Mr. Kaczynski. On that day here in Newtown, as we started realizing what was happening, I know probably most of us thought of who we know that works in the building, what children we knew who might go to Sandy Hook, or you know what our connections might be, and worrying about those people. I'm someone, along with quite a few others, who found out later that day that I actually had a connection with the shooter's family, not with the shooter himself, but with his brother specifically. And so I just wondered what you would say to those of us who have that connection, just in terms of if and how to reach out, I guess.
Yeah, that's a real tough one, you know, because people in my position are very, you know, we're sort of torn because you love your family member, but you hate what they've done. So you don't want to disown them, but you want to disown what they did, which is what most people remember them for. You know, I think most of us carry some element of guilt, so if there's a way to say it that doesn't sound patronizing or, you know, it's not their fault. Don't isolate, because sometimes if you don't know what to say, you sort of avoid the person, and that's not good. And of course there's wrong things to say, and that's not good either. So, you know, you're in a double bind. What do you do? But I think, you know, find a way to show just kindness and decency and sympathy, and listen, maybe listen more than you talk to the person. It's not so much what you say to them, but how open your heart is, I think. And thanks for asking that question, because, you know, it's a tough one in a community like this to ask that question. I just want to mention we've left some flyers. We're in Woodstock, which is not too far away. If someone would like to hear more of this, there's going to be a workshop June 14th through 16th, and we're offering that program free of charge to anyone from Newtown. And There is like a fee for lodging or and meals, but we'd also comp that to anybody who's a victim family member. Again, it's June 14th to 16th, and Dr. Knoll and Lama Yeshe will be here, and we'll also have a panel of people who've been affected by violence. So please take that if you want more information. Our phone number's out there. You can give us a call too. So, you know, if there's something that you think is valuable about this approach, come join us and find out more.
Was there a culminating activity that you wanted to try?
We were thinking about it. Are you okay with that? Yeah, okay, thanks. The brief meditation, and it will be brief, is it's called Developing Love, a meditation practice from His Holiness the Dalai Lama. The Dalai Lama was asked, how can we address the problems in our world? How can we address the many, many difficulties that are in our world? The inequality. How can we protect the earth? How can we take care and nurture our children? How can we help the people who are oppressed in the world? And how can we bring deep spirituality to everyone? And he said that all of these can be resolved by the very last one. If we can bring meaning, love, and true compassion in our hearts, then our children will be cared for and nurtured. We will care for the earth. We will take care of those who have not. So someone asked the Dalai Lama, is the planet increasing in love, or are things getting worse? And he said, no, my experience leads me to believe that love is increasing in this world. He shared a simple practice that will increase love and compassion in the world, and he asked everyone to share it as widely as possible. And as you breathe out to yourself, think that you fill yourself with the greatest of love. You breathe in and love yourself, and breathe out and love others. Breathe in and love yourself, and breathe out and love others. Again, breathing in, love yourself and heal yourself, and breathing out, benefit and cherish others. The Dalai Lama said, if you think about people that you have difficulty cherishing, extend your love to them anyway. During the day, after you have done this brief exercise, extend that attitude to everyone you meet. Practice cherishing even the simplest people that you meet, clerks in the store, people you pass on the street, as well as all of the important people in your life. Cherish the people you love and the people you dislike. Continue this practice no matter what happens or what anyone does to you. These thoughts are very simple, inspiring, and helpful. The practice of cherishing and loving others can be taken very deeply if it is done without words, allowing yourself